Welcome back to Aftonomia, the show where we bring ideas from the libertarian left to everyday people and foster conversation on what we believe, in hopes of proving we all have far more in common than we are trained to believe. My name is Hayward, and I am your host. As always, our intro and outro music come to us from a band called System Failure. The song is called A Bigger Cage is Still a Prison. If you'd ever like to look up the song, the band spells System, C-I-S-T-E-M, for political reasons.
There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
So first, I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to the second installment of Aftonomia. If you haven't listened to the first one, you may decide you want to do that because it gives a bit of an introduction into my political journey and helps make a little bit of sense of where I am today and how I got there. Since this is only the second installment, I thought it would be important to cover some basics. So everything that follows this may make a little bit more sense. Today we'll be discussing, first and foremost, the political compass and what that means for analyzing both your political stance and the political stances of those around you. I find it to be an incredibly useful tool to help orient both myself and other people I'm having political discussions with. You may have noticed at the beginning of the show that I described myself as the libertarian left. And if you've come of age in the American political landscape, the idea of there being a libertarian left may seem a bit strange to you. That's actually a reference to the political compass. So to get into describing the political compass as a concept, you'll have to first understand what it looks like. And of course, I will attach a sample of it in the show notes, which are currently only available on the Facebook page. So be sure to jump over there and have a look. So, the political compass. Picture a square and then bisect that square vertically and horizontally. For those of you that don't mind remembering middle school algebra, you may remember this as the layout that you graphed equations on. Just like the graph, you have an x-axis, which is horizontal, and a y-axis, which is vertical. The x-axis divides it horizontally between authoritarian at the top and libertarian at the bottom. So, for example, you might have a Nazi at the top and an anarchist at the bottom, just to give you an idea of sort of the split you're having. And then a huge amount of territory in between. Now, with the y-axis, which divides between left and right, you have the relationship to capitalism. So all the way to the right, you will have people that believe that the free market solves absolutely everything and there's no regulation that should happen whatsoever. Whereas all the way to the left, you might have varying forms of communism. And just like the above and below, a huge amount of nuance in between. A lot of the theory behind both this show and my activism in general is based on the political compass. It is my belief that the vast majority of people in the American context exist or believe themselves to exist somewhere below the midline of authoritarianism versus libertarianism. That is to say, I believe most of us have some reverence and understanding for the concept of freedom and liberty. So in that way, I believe a lot of us have a lot more common ground than we realize. This is contrasted by the commonly accepted model of political discourse where you have a left and right only. That is to say that a Republican has nothing in common with me and we can't talk about anything. And I have to imagine that maybe in some way this artificial binary divide is what keeps us extremely separate, where we would otherwise have a lot in common. And that doesn't serve really anyone else but the people that rule this society. These artificial labels of Democrat versus Republican draw the battle lines in this very oversimplified and in fact unhelpful way. I found people that exist all over the libertarian right that I find common ground with. And that isn't to say that there aren't people on that side of the spectrum that I completely disagree with. But I found the vast majority of them to be, from my perspective, quite reasonable people and willing to hear ideas from the libertarian left and seem quite receptive to them. Because as far as the relationship to authority, a lot of us feel the same thing. Naturally, I have a strong bias toward the libertarian left. I mean, if I didn't, I probably wouldn't be here. So, I happen to believe that the ideas of the libertarian left are more beneficial and more useful than those of the libertarian right. However, I don't think a lot of what they talk about is worthless because, in fact, we do share a lot. I just happen to think that the concept and furtherance of the Project of Liberty is more seriously addressed by the left. So a bit of homework, if you're willing to do it. Consider where you fall on the spectrum. Do you consider yourself a libertarian or an authoritarian, or perhaps somewhere in between? Do you consider yourself left, or do you consider yourself right, or somewhere in between? Now draw those two lines, and they will intersect where you are. If you feel like you'd rather rely on someone else's understanding and definitions, you may want to Google political compass. You'll come up with a couple tests that will ask you a series of questions to help you understand where you are. You may disagree with your results, but it might give you a starting off point to figure out where you fit. And it will also give you some ideas to grapple with and figure out how best to live out your political persuasion.
I want to climb over these rooftops and over these fences and escape to the places none of these guards would go.
So, as I've stated previously, the purpose of this show is to reach out to folks on the right and have conversations to try to find common ground. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do is answer questions from folks on the right about something that maybe confuses them, or something that they don't think makes any sense, or something that they just really want to have addressed by someone on the left. And I want you to feel absolutely free to send me any questions you might have, and I will address them on this show. The email address is aftonomiapod@protonmail.com. That's the name of the show, pod@protonmail.com. I've asked a bunch of my friends on the right to give me some questions as a means of gathering some material and address in future installments of this podcast. I'm happy to say that I got a lot of really interesting questions from my friends, and I'm hoping to group these in a way that starts to make sense so we can have episodes go by subject. So if someone has a particular interest in something, they can seek out that episode and have that concern addressed. I think that's really important, because if we're going to have multi-partisan dialogue, then it really makes sense to have the barrier to getting this information incredibly low. We want to make it really easy, really accessible. I'm going to do my absolute best to not use any sort of weird, really specific language, because I don't think that helps invite people into things. On the left, we have a dizzying amount of really specialized language that a lot of it even I don't understand. I came to leftism through personal experience in the study of history, not through reading all of these tens of thousands of books of leftist theory that a lot of people feel content to read and discuss among their friends. I want to bring these ideas and concepts to people that are, in a lot of ways, very familiar to me, even though we might disagree on certain subjects. I want to bring these ideas to people in a way that hopefully is pretty engaging and hopefully is pretty informative. But beyond all of that, I want it to be accessible. I want to use the type of language that you would discuss anything with your friends with. Because I hope as time goes on, you see me as a friend in some way or another. One of my other critiques of a lot of leftist podcasts is that they are very comfortable using profane language, and I was a sailor for years. I swear like no one's business. But I think that shrinks your audience when you're trying to have a dialogue with people. I don't think it benefits people that aren't already in this sort of internal club. And then another thing that I find, especially in a lot of the anarchist podcasts, is in between their segments, they'll have sort of like really hardcore, aggressive punk type music that's just a lot of loud noise and yelling and that sort of thing. And while there's a time and place for that, and while that might make sense in an anarchist punk context, I don't really think that serves well for outreach. I can think of a lot of people, sometimes myself included, that will hear a musical break and just be like, you know what, that's not the kind of thing that people that are looking to learn listen to. And granted, I have my own little musical interlude that I play, and it might not be stylistically what everyone likes, but I at least have to hope it's not something that drives people away. I think it's a very appropriate song for the subject matter, and I think it's the type of song that, you can hear and it's not going to make you immediately agitated or angry. It's a couple of folk singers doing their thing.
Sitting here, I prepare myself for the future, when instead of 1 month, I could be here for years. Would I lose hope? Would I take my life? Or would we find a way to break ourselves out of here?
One of the questions I received from a friend of mine, who is for the most part on the right, asked me why people on the left believe that more government is better. Well, it's a bit of a complicated question, but the first thing to address is consulting the political compass. There are two, but of course many more, divisions on the left. The division between libertarian and authoritarian represents the relationship to authority and government itself. At the bottom of the left side, you find a huge number of ideologies that can mostly be found among anarchism in its various strains, libertarian socialism, various forms of social democracy are kind of on the borderline. But a lot of these systems don't necessarily put a huge priority on the state itself. As you move above the line, you find ideologies like Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, Stalinism, all the types of ideologies that you might expect to find on the left, but aren't necessarily representative of the entire left itself. I'm not necessarily going to critique the authoritarian side of the leftist divide, simply because that's an entire episode in of itself. There were a lot of debates going in the left back hundreds of years. There were folks on the Marxist-Leninist side of things that believe after time, when the material conditions allow, that the state itself will wither away because it will simply become obsolete. Folks on the libertarian side of the left have a greater skepticism toward government and believe that the state will never just allow itself to become obsolete. It will always use force to retain its power. Being from the libertarian side of that argument, I am very sympathetic to the idea that the state will not just disappear. And in fact, as it becomes less relevant, it will become more violent in its attempts to retain its authority. And we saw that all throughout history. I mean, it's not something that is a belief that just comes out of nowhere. With that said, folks on the other side of the left might say that the material conditions for the state to wither away have never come about, which, yeah, it's technically true. So it's a bit of a philosophical distinction of do you think that's even possible? A way to answer that question without being too overly in depth with it is to say that some folks on the left do believe that the state is a vehicle toward achieving their end goals, whereas other folks believe the state is a fundamental adversary and can never be trusted and should be resisted just as much as the private forces of capitalism itself. The bottom side of the left views both state and capital as equally threatening to the project of liberty. Another question that I thought would be relevant to address in this particular installment comes from an appearance of mine on a local right-wing radio talk show. The host asked me why people of a left or left-leaning perspective often vote for people that might not be supportive of their rights or of their projects. And this is in particular relationship to the existence of an armed left, contrasted to the mainstream democratic value that guns should be heavily controlled, and some people do indeed believe, super restricted to even outright banned, depending on who you talk to. And how I answered this question to him was to say that a lot of leftists don't believe in voting or engaging with the system at all, simply because by lending our support in the form of a vote to a candidate, we would be conferring legitimacy on them that we don't believe that they have. However, there are a great number of leftists who believe that strategic engagement with the state is important as a means of harm reduction or damage reduction. So sometimes you'll see leftists run as candidates locally, not so much nationally, but you see it from time to time. And they believe that they can do some good by existing in this state role. However, in terms of actually supporting a candidate, some leftists believe that it makes sense to vote for the least, you could say least evil of the options, but I think it's more appropriate to say the closest aligned to your position, because that's the most preferable option from a leftist perspective. But that does not necessarily mean that they believe that that person is good or legitimate or even anywhere close to what we want. It's just the least unpalatable option. So you might have a leftist vote for someone that is against a great degree of leftist principles, but they're an easier adversary than perhaps the Republican candidate. Or you might find a leftist voting for someone that agrees with a decent amount of a given candidate's policies, but will oppose them on certain other policies. Here in Connecticut, we have the issue of tolls. We recently had a Democratic governor elected who ran on the promise of only tolling trucks on our highways. Within a couple days of being elected, he reversed his position and stated that it would be, in fact, cars and trucks. This resulted in the no tolls movement. And while this was for the most part a right-wing movement, it did see a surprising participation from the left. And the reason for that is because we viewed it as a class issue. So a toll on the highways would disproportionately affect working class people, because they're the ones who would have to be paying it quite frequently as they're commuting and just trying to survive from day to day. So leftists, probably on the whole, the ones that chose to vote, thought that this new governor, Ned Lamont, was the most palatable option for the overall list of their priorities, but once he got in, they were not shy about opposing him. Unfortunately, on the right, a lot of people say, well, if you supported... Unfortunately, a lot of people on the right say, well, if you're critical of tolls, you should have voted for Stefanowski, the Republican candidate. But that doesn't take into account that most people are not single-issue voters. There are a lot of issues that someone has to filter through in order to decide which candidate works best for them. And that sort of highlights a really big issue with the government itself. You have to find these little compromises here and there. But that doesn't mean you have to accept every single thing that given candidate goes for. Once they're in office, you have the ability to challenge them and force them to follow the will of the people. Because there's no guarantee that that person is going to represent the majority will of the populace on every given issue. And it's incumbent upon the people that want to participate in that system to force the people in authority to listen to them. So there are some leftists who do not believe in this system at all and believe that voting is counterproductive and that they should instead agitate and organize for revolution, rebellion, rejection of the system, making it obsolete. There are a bunch of different names for it and a bunch of different strategies, but basically some people believe it's a waste of time to engage with the system that we don't believe has any legitimacy. And that's a common perspective. And then there are other people that believe that while the system is an adversary, you can make strategic concessions as a way of making the living conditions better for people from your perspective. And other people, somewhat surprisingly, may choose to vote for the right-wing candidate, and that's not necessarily because they support them, but it's because they believe that voting in, from their perspective, the worst candidate will accelerate the contradictions of this society and result in a rebellious moment. This is a strategy known as accelerationism. A lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but some people on the left felt that a vote for Trump would accelerate all of the problems of this system and create an insurrectionary moment that might provide us with an opportunity to overthrow this system more rapidly than would happen under a Clinton, for example. The idea being that if Clinton were elected, most of the Democrats, as their signs say, would have been at brunch. Whereas if Trump gets into office, you have a massive coalition of people that are against him. There are a lot of problems with this strategy, and there are people that embrace it on both the left and the right, but it exists. It's something that exists in the political landscape, and it's something worth knowing about. So yeah, on the whole, the left has sort of a complicated relationship with voting and which candidates they do and don't support, and whether or not they actually support them or are just picking the most easily battled adversary. A lot of people on the left, myself included, view voting as a means of picking the battlefield on which your conflict with the state will be fought. So perhaps you might find it better to fight on more favorable territory than territory that is unbelievably hostile at its outset. There's a song called "Of Ballots and Barricades" by a singer named Pat the Bunny, who basically says something along the lines of, vote if it feels right for you, and don't if you think it just holds us down. Just tell me what we're going to do on November 3rd to make sure there's no government to elect 2 years from now. And that sort of captures the thinking on a lot of the left, where, yeah, we can vote. It's not like it takes any time to vote, but that shouldn't be the center and focus of your activism. You know, that should be something you do if you feel like it, to create a more favorable condition for the inevitable conflict with the state and capital. There's a meme that I saw quite recently, which I found fairly entertaining. It was a tweet by a guy who said, "I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, and my biggest political ambition is that we can one day overthrow Bernie Sanders." And in addition to finding that pretty amusing, I did find that fairly emblematic of my politics as well. I wouldn't consider myself a Sanders supporter, but I do think he brings a lot of interesting discussion to the table, and unlike most candidates, is willing to seriously engage with a lot of the problems in our society that both parties systemically ignore. And I think that's really important. I don't have to agree with him, and you don't have to agree with him on all of his proposed solutions, but I think very few people would be able to argue coherently that a lot of the problems that he brings into the national discussion are not worth addressing. And I think that's valuable. Since 2016, a lot of people have moved to the left, and in no small part because Bernie Sanders has brought left critiques of our system to the mainstream. And it's opened up a lot of people to thinking about our system in ways that had not been common for 50 years or more. And I think that's important. And I think anyone that values critical thinking has to have some value on shifting the national discourse toward a critical lens of our system, because that's how we're going to find a way to make our system better, is to constantly reevaluate our positions and constantly look for flaws and constantly find ways to make things as best as they can be for ourselves and our children and our neighbors and everyone around us. If we're trying to make a better world, we have to be constantly looking for problems and constantly looking how to solve them and constantly organizing to do just that. So while I have personal gripes with Bernie Sanders, especially considering his misappropriation and rampant misuse of the language of revolution, He's brought a lot of people to the table and brought a lot of people into the political discussion that were not there previously, and I think that's valuable. So that's going to close it out for this installment of Autonomia. The issues that I covered in this show are super broad and super in-depth. I just wanted to give sort of a taste of these issues, because the intention of the show is to start a conversation and start a dialogue. I don't think it's productive to go super in-depth into a topic that a person may or may not be interested in. So I want to provide an introduction, an invitation to join this vibrant discussion that happens on all of these issues and many more. I want to remind you that the perspectives put forward in this installment are my personal opinions. They are the opinions of a person on the libertarian left. They're not the only opinion, and they shouldn't be. I hope fairly soon to have other guests on the show in order to expand the discourse and broaden the range of topics we can discuss. I also hope that anyone listening to this show will respond with anything that might have sounded either strange or incorrect or in conflict with their understanding of the world. I also encourage anyone that feels that what I've discussed here was insightful or useful in any way to let me know, because I want to make this show very interactive with the listener, because the whole purpose of this show is reaching out to you, the listener. I want to make sure you feel like you have a very participatory relationship with this podcast. So let me know how you felt about it. Let me know if you have other issues you'd like to have discussed. Let me know if there's something you think I missed or didn't address fully or even got incorrect. Let me know what you think. And let me know if you would like to participate in this show, either as someone who can bring questions to the show or even as a guest on the show. I'm really open to having guests on the show as time goes on. I just want to get some basic stuff out of the way so we can lay the groundwork for what this show is going to be about. And then we can sort of more explore how this show will evolve. Because I think it's really important to keep something dynamic and moving and make sure that we provide engaging content to people from a diversity of opinions. This show is going to get really boring really fast if I'm the only voice you ever hear, because my voice isn't particularly entertaining, and just me talking to my phone is only going to be so engaging to the listener. With that, I want to thank you so much for listening to the show. I want to thank the people that encouraged me to do this podcast. I want to thank the local radio show hosts that gave me some advice on the second episode and how to improve it. And I hope to continue that relationship as time goes on. And just remember, please, talk politics. Talk to the people around you. Figure things out together. The only people that are served by our self-isolation are the people that control and rule this system and all of us that are inside of it.
'Cause there's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky. The animals as they go about their lives. Feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes. But tonight this hell keeps me enclosed. For if we don't have our freedom, if we are captured by their iron hands, then the vision for fire, it burns so much more bright. There's no justice in the system. A bigger cage is still a prison. Well, I hope that somewhere someone breaks free tonight.